Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture number 8, which is the fourth lecture on labor supply. Welfare refers to an assistance programs which is sponsored by government for needy individuals and families, including the schemes like food stamps, healthcare assistance, unemployment compensation. Accordingly, welfare denotes the range of government programs providing a financial or other assistance to the individuals or societal groups who cannot support themselves. And further, the qualification for benefits depends on several factors, including family size, income level. So, in this lecture, we will try to explore that how these welfare programs supported by the government can alter the work incentives of the individuals, how these welfare programs are going to affect the labor supply decision of the individuals. Let us begin by considering a simple program that grants an eligible person a cash grant. Suppose the eligible person, such as a single mother with child, are given a cash grant of say $500 per month as long as they remain outside the labor force. If these persons enter the labor market, the government officials immediately assume that the women no longer need the public assistance and the women are dropped from this welfare role, regardless of how much they earn in the labor market. So, it is a program which offers some amount of cash grant if the individual is not entering into the labor market. The moment the individual enters into the labor market, the grant will be stopped. Let us try to understand how this take it or leave it kind of grant programs affects the work incentive of the individuals. Let us try to understand this with the help of this graph. On the x-axis, we have taken the hours of leisure, and the y-axis we have taken the consumption. We are trying to understand how this welfare program, this kind of cash grant welfare programs affects the work hour decision of the individuals through this optimization problem with the indifference curve and the budget line. Let us say that individual does not have any non-labor income. If that individual does not have any non-labor income, then his endowment point is here at point E. With the market wage rate, let us say $10 per hour, for that individual, the budget constant, the budget line is FE. And with this budget constant, if the individual enters into the labor market, he decides to work, he is going to have a solution at point P with this utility function U0. So, at point P, worker decides that the individual decides that he will work for 40 hours and he will have 70 hours of leisure and he will have some amount of consumption. This is the initial stage. If there is no program is there is no cash grant. Now, introduction of this program, this cash grant, this welfare program, the individual is eligible to get $500 of cash grant if he is not going to work. Now, point here is that if he is going to get a $500 of cash grant, then it is going to be his non-labor income. As a result, his endowment point is now moving from point E to point G. So, this is the amount of cash grant which he or she gets. Now, At point G, if you look at the maximization, utility maximization, the individual maximizes its utility at point G with an indifference curve, utility curve U1. So, comparing these 2 points at point P and point G, point P which gives an interior solution and point G which gives an corner solution. The individual at point G is operating at a higher utility function, which means compared to P he is going to get more utility. So, the individual will prefer to take this cash grant and to operate at this point G. As a result, his work hour is going to be 0. So, introduction of this kind of programs substantially reduces the labor supply of the individual. So, this type of take it or leave it cash grant can induce many workers to drop out of the labor market. In fact, it is clear that low wage workers are most likely to choose the welfare solution of this particular kind. So, what is happening here is that there is an improvement in the endowment point from point E to point G, which increases the workers' reservation wage and which reduced the likelihood of low wage persons to enter into the labor market. However, at this point it is important to note that these welfare programs do not lower the labor force participation rate of low wage workers, because these workers, they have a lack of work ethics. No, it is not like that. After all, we have implicitly assumed that the preference of these low wage workers as represented by this number of indifference curves, they are identical to the preference with the high wage workers. Rather, what is happening because of these welfare programs, these kind of welfare programs, that these welfare programs, they reduce the work incentive of low wage workers, because it is these workers who are most likely to find that this economic opportunity provided by this welfare system are better than those who avail in the labor market. So, it is not just a kind of problem of work ethics. It is just because these kind of programs, they increase the opportunity, economic opportunities or the opportunity set of the individuals as compared to those who are working in the labor market. So, therefore, they will withdraw themselves from their labor market and they will opt for this kind of programs. In view of this extreme disincentive efforts of this program, as we discussed, that some of these programs, they allow the receivers to remain in the labor force. So, what we discussed is that either this take it or leave it kind of cash grants substantially reduce the work hour of the individuals. But there are certain social assistance programs which typically allows the welfare recipients to remain in the labor force and also to opt for these welfare programs. So, in those cases what happens is that although these welfare recipients can work, the amount of cash grant is often reduced by some specific amount for every hour they work in the labor market. So, let us discuss the effect of such welfare programs where the individual is allowed to have this kind of welfare programs as well as is allowed to participate in the labor market. Let us take an example. Suppose if the woman does not work at all and goes on welfare, her monthly income would be $500, assuming that she does not have any other non-labor income. So she is opting for this welfare program where she will get $500. For the purpose of this example, suppose that the government takes away 50 cents from each cash grant for every dollar earned in the labor market. She is allowed to work in the labor market, but the government will take away 50 cents from the cash grant for every dollar earned in the labor market. This means that the woman works 1 hour at the wage of $10, her labor earnings increases by 10, but her grant is reduced by 5. So let me explain it once again. If the woman works 1 hour at a wage of $10, her labor earnings increased by 10, but her grant is reduced by $5. Which means if the worker is going to work for 1 hour in the labor market, she is going to get $505. If she decides to work for 2 hours, her labor earnings at the wage rate of 10 will be 20, but her grant is reduced by 10. So every time when he works for 1 hour getting a wage rate of 10, the effective net wage rate is coming down to be 5. So the total income would be then 510. So every additional hours of work increased the income only by $5. Under this reducing size of the welfare grant, the government is actually taxing the welfare recipient the wage at a 50%, which means every time she is working, getting a $10, his additional increase in the total income is increased by just 5. So therefore, it becomes important to differentiate between woman's actual wage rate, which is 10, but the net wage rate is 5. Let's explain it through the indifference curve and the budget constraint with this optimization framework. How the individual is going to take decision that how many hours he or she should work with this kind of welfare programs. Now, if you look at this graph, this is again the framework of this welfare maximization framework. On x-axis we have taken hours of leisure, on y-axis we have taken consumption. Without any kind of government programs, the worker is optimizing at point P by consuming 70 hours of leisure and some amount of, this is the amount of consumption. This is where the worker is without any welfare program, because we are assuming that the worker does not have any non-labor income. So his endowment point is at point E and his budget line is EF, and the worker is operating at the utility function U0, and P is the optimal point. Now, if the worker is going to opt this welfare program, which means he is going to get $500. So his endowment point is now going to move from point E to point G. So this is the new endowment point for the worker after availing this welfare program. Now what is happening? At this point the worker is allowed to enter into the labor market, he is allowed to work while opting this welfare program. So the wage rate is 10, the market wage rate is 10, the actual wage rate is 10. So every hour he is going to work, he is going to get a $10. But his total income is going to reduced by 50%. So it's a kind of taxing 50% the earned income, which means the slope of the net wage rate is going to be 5. So this is his budget constant Hg, where the slope of this budget constant is -5. Now considering this budget constant, the individual is optimizing at point R with an indifference curve or the utility function U1. So comparing to this point P and R, definitely R is on a higher indifference curve. So the worker is opting this point R. As a result, the worker is having 10 hours of work and 100 hours of leisure, and he is going to consume certain amount of consumption. So the worker moved from point P to point R. In this case, the hours of work has been increased by 10 as compared to the previous case. It's important to note that this movement from P to R happens through Q. This is the net effect, but if we decompose this effect, we can get the substitution effect and income effect. Let's try to find out the income effect. Now, when the wage has increased, wage rate is 10, just to understand that how much is because of this income effect, we draw a parallel line DD corresponding to this line, the wage rate which was 10. So the tangent point is at point Q. So the worker moved from point P to R via Q. So movement from P to Q is just because his income has increased, his wage is increased. Now earlier his income was 500, now it's for 510. So increase in the wage rate increase the income. So movement from this P to Q is the income effect. While comparing these 2 points Q and R, they are on the same indifference curve. So the individual prefers R as compared to Q. This is what the substitution effect. So earlier, without any welfare program, the worker is consuming 70 hours of leisure or having 40 hours of work. Now because of, if it is just take it or leave it program, the worker is having 0 hours of work. If it is a kind of program where the worker can avail the program as well as take part in the labor market, now the worker decides that he will work for 10 hours. So it's this kind of program increase the work hours. This example describes the work incentive problem introduced by the welfare programs. If our model adequately represents how persons make their work decisions, it is impossible to formulate a relative generous welfare program without substantially reducing the work incentives. However, avoiding cash grants to recipients as welfare programs they do, it reduces both the probability of a person working and the number of hours worked by those who remain on the job. Further, in addition, the efforts to recover some of the cash grant money from the working welfare recipients, the government effectively imposes a tax on work activities. This tax reduces the price of the leisure and further it lowers the number of hours that the welfare recipients will work. So, up to this point, our model of labor supply analyzes the decision of whether to work and how many hours to work from the point of view of a worker who allocates his time in a single time period, who ignores that the fact that he will have to make similar choices continuously over many years. So, whatever we discussed so far is that at a particular point of time, it is the decision of the workers how they decide that how many hours they should work. But a worker works throughout his life. So, he or she has to take into consideration the entire life cycle, that how he is going to supply his labor hour over his life cycle. In fact, because consumption and leisure decisions are made over the entire working life, the workers can trade some of the leisure time today in return of the additional consumptions tomorrow. Let us say, for instance, a person who devotes a great deal of time to his job today can save some of the additional earnings and use these savings to increase his consumption of goods in future. So, if the worker divides his life cycle into different time periods, then he can trade off this. Work at a particular point of time and consume leisure at another point of time. So, this is what we call the life cycle path of an individual. Life cycle path of an individual with respect to the wages and the hours of work, which we call the age earning profile, which talks about that how the individuals they supply their labor supply over their life cycle. And this age earning profile implies that the price of leisure is relatively low for younger and older workers and is highest for workers in their prime age. So, you can see in this panel A, we have taken on the x axis we have taken the age, on the y axis we have taken the wage rate. You can see the graph how it takes the shape when it comes to age and wage rate. On panel B we have taken the age and we have taken the hours of work. So, you can see how the hours of work and the age relationship. So, the point here is that the worker has to take into consideration about the labor supply decisions over the life cycle, over the lifetime. How the workers' labor supply should respond to wage increase that occurs between the age 20 to 30 or to the wage decline that might occur as the worker nears to the retirement age. So, it is important to note that these type of wage changes are part of the aging process for a given worker. So, a change in the wage along the worker's wage profile is called an evolutionary wage change. This evolutionary wage change indicates how the wages of a particular worker evolves over time. Further, it is crucial to note that an evolutionary wage changes has no impact on the worker's total lifetime income. The worker fully expects his wage to go up as he matures and to go down as he gets closer to the retirement. So, as a result, this evolutionary wage change alters the price of leisure, but it does not alter the value of the total opportunity set available to the workers over his life cycle. Further, to be very specific and precise, suppose we know that our life cycle age earning profile takes on the precise shape of the curve that which we discussed in the figure. The fact that our wage rises slightly from the age 37, 38 or declines slightly from this 57, 58, does not increase or decrease our lifetime wealth. So, we have a steady lifetime wealth, and we already expected that these evolutionary wage changes to occur, and they have already been incorporated in the calculation of our lifetime wealth. We can expect that this is his uh, uh, life cycle profile. Suppose the wage falls as the worker nears to the retirement age, and let us consider these questions. Would the worker be better off by working a lot of hours at the age of 50s and consume the leisure at the age of 60s? Or would the worker be better off by working relatively few hours at the age of 50 and devoting a great deal of time to his job in his 60s? Let us try to understand. The worker will clearly find that it is worthwhile to work more hours at the age of 50, invest the money and buy consumption goods and leisure at some point in the future when the wage is lower and leisure is not as expensive. After all, this type of labor supply decision would increase the worker's lifetime wealth. It gives him a much larger opportunity set than would be available if he were to work many hours in his 60s when the wage is low and consume many hours of leisure in his 50s when the wage is high. In fact, this kind of situation occurs when the worker is at his young age. His wage is relatively low at the young age, and he will find it optimal to consume the leisure activities when he is very young rather than his 30s and 40s. So, when the price of those leisure activities will be very high. So, the argument therefore suggests that we will generally find it optimal to concentrate on work activities in those years when the wage is high and concentrate on leisure activities in those years when the wage is low. So, in the end, this approach to the life cycle labor supply decisions implies that the hours of work and the wage rate should move together over time for a particular worker, as it has been seen in the figure. So, the implication differs from our earlier conclusion. Earlier we had concluded that a wage increase generates both income and substitution effect, and therefore could be a negative relationship between wage and hours of work if the income effect dominates. So, this important difference between these two models is that the one period model, which is the static model, which we talked about, that at a particular point of time how the individual workers they take the decision that how many hours they should work in our previous discussion, and the life cycle model, which is a dynamic one. So, this difference arises because two models mean very different things by change in the wages. In one period model, an increase in the wage expands the worker's opportunity set. Hence, it creates an income effect that increases the demand for leisure. Whereas, in the life cycle model, it is an evolutionary wage change. The wage change that workers expect as the age changes. So, in this life cycle model, this evolutionary wage change does not change the total lifetime income available to a particular worker and leaves the lifetime opportunity set intact. However, if we were to compare two workers with different age earning profiles, the difference in hours of work between these two workers could be affected by both income and substitution effect. So, this is how over a lifetime, the relationship between these hours of work and the wage changes with this life cycle model with an evolutionary wage change. Further, the life cycle approach suggests a link not only between the wage and hours of work, but also between the wage and the labor force participation rate. As we saw earlier, the labor force participation decision depends on a comparison of reservation wage to the market wage. So, in each year of the life cycle, therefore, the worker will compare the reservation wage to the market wage. Suppose initially the reservation wage is roughly constant over time. The person is then more likely to enter to the labor market in the periods when the wage is high. As a result, the participation rate are likely to be low for young workers and high for the workers in their prime working years and low again for the old workers. So, the key implication of this analysis can be summarized that a person will work few hours in those periods of the life cycle when the wage is low and will work for many hours in those periods when the wage is high. Further, if you look at this life cycle behavior, the evidence on the age earning profile suggests that the wage is relatively low for young workers and increases as the workers mature, accumulate various types of skills, and it may decline slightly towards when they are aging. So, the model suggests that the profile of hours of work over the life cycle will have exactly the same shape of the age earning profiles. Hours of work increases as the wage rises and declines as the wage falls. So, the theoretical prediction that the people allocate their time over the life cycle so as to take advantage of the changes in the price of leisure, which we call the intertemporal substitution. Further, it's not only does the labor supply responds to the changes in the economic opportunity over a worker's life cycle, but workers also may adjust their labor supply to take advantage of the changes in the economic opportunities which is induced by business cycles, macroeconomic conditions. So, therefore, let us ask the question that do recessions motivate many persons to enter the labor market in order to make up the income of the family members who have lost their jobs due to recession? Or do the unemployed give up hope of finding work in a depressed market condition and leave the labor force altogether? So, what we are trying to understand here is that just because of the changes in the macroeconomic environment in the economy due to business cycles or some other conditions, how the workers they are going to adjust their labor supply. So, the question here is that is there any increase in the employment or there will be any decrease in the labor supply? So, there could be two effects because of this business cycle, because of the changing in the macroeconomic environment and its effect on labor supply. The effects could be the added worker effect or the effects could be the discouraged worker effects. So, the labor supply over business cycle have two effects. One is the added worker effects, another one is the discouraged worker effect. Let us try to understand what is added worker effects and what is discouraged worker effects. The added worker effect provides one possible mechanism for a relation between the business cycle and the labor force participation rate. So, under this hypothesis, what we are saying is that The so-called secondary worker who are currently out of the labor market, such as young workers, young persons, or mother with small children, those who are the secondary member of the family and they are out of the labor force, out of the labor market, are affected by the recession because the main breadwinner becomes unemployed or the main breadwinner is having a wage cut. So, as a result, family income goes down and the secondary workers get jobs to make up this loss. So, there will be added worker effect, and this effect implies that labor force participation rate of secondary workers will increase and it will be a counter cyclical trend, which means it moves in the opposite direction to the business cycle. So, it rises during recession, the added worker effect, and falls during expansion. Whereas this discouraged worker effect argues that many unemployed workers find it almost impossible to find jobs during the recession and simply they give up. Rather than incur the cost associated with the fruitless job search activities during recession, these workers decides to wait out the recession and drop out the labor force. So, as a result, you will find that this discouraged worker effects, the labor force participation rate has a pro-cyclical trend. It falls during recession and it increases during expansion. Well, of course, the business cycle will generate both added worker effect as well as the discouraged worker effect. The important question is, therefore, is that which effect dominates empirically? This question is typically addressed by correlating the labor supply participation rate of a particular group with the aggregate unemployment rate, because unemployment rate is the summary measure of the aggregate economic activities and the labor force participation is the summary measure of aggregate economic activities. So, if the added worker effect dominates, the correlation would be positive because the deterioration in the economic condition encourages more persons to enter into the labor market. If the discouraged worker effect dominates, then correlation would be negative because the high level of unemployment in the economy convinces that many workers give up on their job and search and drop out of this labor market. There is massive evidence that correlation between this labor force participation rate of many groups and the aggregate unemployment rate is negative. So, mostly what we find is that during business cycle, the discouraged workers effect dominates. Because the discouraged worker effect dominates, the correlation between the labor force participation and the business cycle, the official unemployment report might be too low. If you remember, why it will be low? If you remember the things that how we measure this unemployment rate, how we define the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is defined as the ratio of persons who are unemployed to the persons who are in the labor force, which means employed plus unemployed. So, if an unemployed person becomes discouraged and leaves the labor force, he or she is no longer actively looking for work and hence will no longer be counted among the unemployed. So, as a result, the official unemployment rate may greatly understate the unemployment problem in the aggregate economy during severe recessions. However, the argument that the discouraged workers should be included in unemployment statistics is an open question. But some of these discouraged workers may be taking advantage of this relatively poor labor market condition to engage in the leisure activities. So, this can be possible. As we discussed earlier, the life cycle model of labor supply suggests that some of the workers choose to allocate the time to the labor market during certain periods of their life cycle and to consume leisure during other periods. So, the real wage typically rises during expansion when the demand for labor is high and declines when the recession, when the demand for labor is reduced. So, we would then expect that labor force participation rate to be high at the peak economic activities and to decline as the economic conditions worsen. So, the pro-cyclical trend in the labor force participation rate then arises not because the workers give up hope of finding jobs during recession, because it is not worthwhile to work in those periods when the real wage is low. Further, it is important to note that the so-called discouraged workers are doing precisely what the life cycle model of the labor supply suggests that they should do. They allocate their time optimally over the life cycle by consuming leisure when it is cheap to do so. So, during recession, this is how the workers they behave and they supply their labor supply in the economy. In the next lecture, we will discuss about labor demand. Thank you.